Let's get started. I'd like to express my appreciation to you for taking the time. In this presentation, I discuss responsibility for diachronic artifacts from the legal philosophical perspective, particularly in terms of intergenerational justice. I will examine what responsibility we, the present generation, have for the artifact of the past. My argument is that intergenerational justice must be considered alongside present justice, and that in some cases it may be even justified to abandon the artifacts of the past. Let's see what intergenerational justice is here. It refers to the normative relationship between people in the past, present, and future. Examples of specific issues that can be discussed include the following. Present and future people issues include global environmental protection, conservation of depleted resources, and management of radioactive waste. The problems of the people of the past and present include the inheritance or destruction of the historical heritage. Legal philosophical issues might include whether to abide by the constitution of the past. Intergenerational justice is a unique philosophical issue that are different from current issues of justice. Co-temporal normative theory, such as modern liberalism, represented by John Rawls, have not focused sufficiently on the intergenerational problem. It is also difficult to tackle because there is a fundamental uncertainty about the future and the past. To clarify the question here, why and to what extent should we, present generation, care about the dead or unborn people? Let's consider this from recent issue. This picture shows the statue of an old slave trader being vandalized by critics of racism. Even the greatest figures of the past can be criticized by values of the present. The recent Black Lives Matter BLM movement, for example, has accused them of being responsible for artifacts of the past. Some of the issues at stake here include the following. How do artifacts of the past change their public meaning? Should we preserve the past legacy for future people to learn about history? Or, in some cases, do we have a responsibility even to destroy the past legacy in order to break the current discrimination? Let's consider which of the artifacts of the past we should keep and which we should abandon. We need to divide the artifact into several cases. First is the case of artifact from which we can benefit from them. We should then maintain the artifact for our own benefits. In other words, this is not so much a question of intergenerational justice as it is a question of our present distributive justice. Critical is the second case on artifacts that we no longer benefit from, and moreover, harmful and burdensome. Examples are artifacts of historical and cultural value, or artifacts that have value only to future generations. Why should we inherit such things, despite the burdens or harms? And if we abandon them, it is wrong for the people in the past or future. The point here is that the intentions of designers of past artifacts may change over time. It may come to be perceived differently. For example, the negative legacies of the past related to war, colonialism, and racism also change in meaning over time. This picture shows the main building of International Christian University in Japan. It used to be a laboratory for fighter planes and a symbol of war. But today, it is a symbol of peace and learning. Let's consider two approaches here. The first is a diachronic question. If the meaning of artifacts can change over time, should we preserve them for future generations to learn from history? The second is a synchronic approach. If artifacts of the past are causing us burden in the present, should we prioritize solving the problem of the present? The burden includes not only the harm of discrimination, but also the cost of maintenance. How we understand intergenerational justice is important to consider this issue. This understanding can be divided in two parts, depending on how we think about the present generation's ability to make judgment. If yes, we, present people, are likely to be responsible for not inheriting the harms of the past. And for tremendous evil, destruction may be permissible or even morally required. Then, if answer is no, we must not deprive our future people of the opportunity to learn. We should also archive the negative legacies of the past. It may be arrogant to judge the past by values of the present. Let's consider a further problem. When it comes to intergenerational justice, how far should we think about generation? Of course, we cannot take into account all the people of the past and future. Diachronic theory has its own tasks in this regard, unlike the synchronic theory, which can deal with the whole society. Then, it is useful to delimit the temporal scope of intergenerational issues. First, short-range issues, for example, reproductive ethics, public pension system. And second, middle-range issues, environmental protection, reservation of resources, and so on. And the last, long-range issues. Management of nuclear waste is a typical example. In this way, we can divide diverse intergenerational issues into appropriate sizes. The important thing is not to tackle the problems that are too huge in time scale. But the issues of inheritance of artifacts is such a difficult one because it involves all of this. Here's an interesting example of the problem of memory transfer. This picture shows a final disposal site for radioactive waste in Finland. It is called Onkalo. It means cave in English. It is deep underground, where radioactive waste will be maintained 100,000 years. The biggest concern is that people in the future might dig it up because they might not know it's buried. This concern is based on the assumption that future people may be completely different from today's people in terms of their knowledge or technology. In Japan, this concern is not often raised. Perhaps this is because people in Japan think that future generations will be more or less the same as they are. Various attempts are being made to address this concern by passing on memory. For example, warnings in language and symbols, and legal obligation to preserve documents. Now, let me conclude. First, how we think about responsibility of artifacts depends on our capacity to make judgment and how we view past and future generations. And we need to have institutions and mechanisms in place to preserve information on which to base appropriate judgment and public meaning making. However, the inheritance of artifacts is not only an intergenerational issue, but also a present one. Intergenerational disconnection may be justified if it is too burdensome for people of the present, or if it causes discrimination or other harms. What this means is that intergenerational justice must be considered in balance with present justice. I got some useful comments from Mr. Motoki Miura. My sincere thanks to him. For response to him, see explanatory text on YouTube. Comments and questions on this presentation are accepted via YouTube, email, and Twitter. Please do not hesitate. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Motoki Miura. Before I start, let me congratulate Mr. Akira for his clarity. I've known him since I started my first master, and he was already, back then, he was already one of the leading legal philosophers of intergenerational justice in Japan. So it is my honor to be here, to be a commentator for people who are present for his talk. It is my duty today to deliver a few comments on Mr. Akira's normative range problem on intergenerational justice. And I intend to do so by first summarizing his point, and second posing three questions, mostly for clarifications. Let me start to locate Mr. Akira's work in a broader context of a narrow area called philosophy of law or jurisprudence. These two terms are usually thought to be interchangeable. If I may be crude, I would say philosophy of law is a radical re-examination of fundamental issues concerning law or a legal system. Among philosophers of law in Japan, it is somewhat conventional to divide the entire area into three main categories. And I owe this categorization and explanation to Professor Morimura. A first and most hot area is called theories of justice. And it does have a long tradition. It sort of it gave birth to a new version after John Rawls' work in 1970s, followed by Robert Nozick, and Mr. Akira is one of the latest living descendant of this tribe. And there's other area called that inquires into legal concepts, and we do have big figures dating back from 19th century, John Austin, followed by somewhat contemporary figures like Hans Kelsen and H.L.A. Hart, two of the biggest figures in 20th century jurisprudence. And we do have another area called which inquires into the nature of interpretation, and it has a lot to do with actual legal practice done by judges and lawyers. And we have a big name called Ronald Dworkin. So Mr. Akira's work primarily focuses on the first of these theories of justice. And what do we make of his talk? So let me move on to the points and joints of his talk. Well, he focuses on justice between contemporary generation and yet to be born future generation. And there are many topics he's covered, but if I may focus on one particular thing that seems to be the mainstream, it would be the conflict between synchronic approach and diachronic approach. One sees the issue as a redistribution of goods, and we could say redistribution of duties at the same time among agents now and here. So it sort of reduces the entire issue into the issue in the present generation, and sometimes it becomes the issue between individuals, but sometimes it's also an issue among nations, countries. And there's other approach called Diachronic approach, which takes more universal stance to the duties that transcends generations. So it sees justice as a matter that penetrates every generation, and we do have duty to care about the next generation. So do the next generation have the duty to care about the next generation, hopefully. And in this situation, Mr. Akira does not choose one or the other, nor does he see it as the problem of such. So he doesn't see it as a choice between synchronic approach or diachronic approach. He sees universal consideration as one of those what we care. So universal considerations to care about the next generation is one important thing, but it's simply one of those important things. And to support his argument, he finds a possibility in multiple levels of agency. So we exist not only as individuals, but also we exist as sometimes as families, couples, partnerships, and also exist as corporations, legal persons, community, as states, and of course the human race as a whole. So if I may rephrase his main point, I fear I commit the fallacy of misunderstanding, but if I may be blatant, I would say his point was redistribution of good is one thing, survival is quite another. So he tries to separate the issue of reproduction from other normative issues and putting it in a different levels argument. So that's pretty much what he had to say. What do we make of his point? What should I say? Well, I've got 3 comments to make. Let me start with the first one. What about individual rights? He says, well, reproduction belongs to a certain level of agency, and individual rights belongs to other levels of agency. So we should not mix these issues. But then intergenerational justice do occur and persist in certain areas of human lives. Take childbearing. Childbearing puts a huge burden on not only on the individual who actually bears a child, it also becomes a heavy burden, more than a challenge for people who care about the child and actual guardians who take care of the children. And it puts heavy burden on their personal choice, careers, personal pastime. And if we say, well, we could impose certain duty to reproduce because it belongs to different levels argument, then doesn't that ignore the fundamental issue of the conflict of interest through different levels? So that's my first argument. That's my first point. Not quite an argument. I do know Mr. Akira has a good answer for this. And my second question concerns the past-present relationships. Mr. Akira focuses on justice relationships to future generations that do not yet exist. But then, past legacies are also important because they easily turn into contemporary issues. Think of iconic statues like Sir Winston Churchill's that's still standing in Parliament Square in London. As we all know, if I may state the obvious, it was under heavy attack when the Black Lives Matter movement was very hot, and nuclear wastes are other example that remain in the present, that remain from the past and will be in the future. And these issues, decisions on these issues by present generation frame the future prosperity or perhaps suffering of different generations. So my question is past, present, and present-future relationship asymmetric by quality? Is there a shared structure at all? So he seems to be mainly focusing on present-future relationship, but what about past, present, and future relationships? So that's another comment. And let me move on to the last third point. I wonder what does intergenerational justice has to offer on immigration policy. Although Kyowa defined short-term issues in certain generation are intra-generational issues. So it's a matter of intragenerational justice. But then the present generation is a cradle for the next generation. It's like a departure line. It's like an airport for generations. Different generations arrive and then eventually move into their graveyard, but new generations are born in the present time, so they sort of depart from this time to the future. And look up the unbalanced pension system, assessment system we have, where the living generations support the older generations. We are forced to choose between reproduction and redistribution. If we prioritize redistribution, that will definitely damage the financial status of the younger working generations, while if we prioritize reproduction, that will definitely sacrifice the older generation who are mostly living on their pension and has a vast number of population in it. So the reproduction is not everything. However, generational balance is urgent still. So my last question is, what if any intergenerational justice bears on immigration policy? We're living in we are individually dire, collectively superfluous population. One country is more Asian than the other, so why not open one country? Why not normatively ask one country to accept more immigration so that it can keep fit in terms of generational balance? So should I keep state the balance of Asian society by accepting immigrations? That's my third point. I hope these questions will be of some help in facilitating the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Motoki Miura for his excellent comments. His comment will surely contribute to further clarifying my argument. First, will the collective rights of future generation constrain the individual rights of present generation? Miura take issue with the rights of individual. Indeed, the rights of future generation and the individual rights of the present generation can conflict. If present generation must sacrifice their own lives in order to fulfill their responsibility to care for future generation, are we being ruled by future generations? Or if future generations have the right to be born, do we have an obligation to produce children? If so, this would be a violation of our reproductive rights. In this way, people are not only ruled from the past, but also from the future. Would intergenerational justice in this sense be attractive? I don't think so. I'd like to take a view of intergenerational justice that limits a rule from past and future. In fact, such a view of intergenerational justice is not necessarily common. Remember that social contract theory has emerged as a counter to the royal theocracy. In the terms of this presentation, synchronic normative theory constrained diachronic normative theory and ensured present people's self-determination. But I see it the other way. Now, with the emphasis on global environmental crisis and the collapse of the welfare state, the present generation is being forced to economize our life for the sake of future generations. And in order to reclaim the right of self-determination for the present generation, I have attempted to divide the generational problem into several appropriate sizes: short range, middle range, and long range. By not viewing future generation as too large, but rather as with a time span for each problem, we can reduce some of the rule from the future. Second, what is the relationship between past and present? Is it possible to consider symmetrically the relationship between past and present generations and the relationship between present and future generations? At first glance, they appear to be asymmetrical. Past generations have left us a lot of good and bad things. Past generations have not done so intentionally. We, the present generation, only receive them one way. So, is the relationship between the present generation and the future generation the same? Probably not. Future generation will be greatly affected by the decisions of the present generation. At the extreme, the present generation can even exterminate future generation. Has Jonas argued for responsibility according to the capacities of present generations, but even among people in the present, differences in capacities are the basis for the responsibility. Remember the responsibility for one's children. However, there is also a common structure. We have inherited many good and bad things from past generations. Nevertheless, we have improved our own lives. This has been the case throughout human history. Future generations will advance in technology in the same way we have. Is it unfair to assume this? Proponents of the precautionary principle might argue that it is unfair, but it will lead to the rule from the future as discussed earlier. The lives and technologies of future generations will continue to develop more or less as people have in the past. I believe it is more important to make this assumption in order not to place an undue burden on the present generation. In fact, the correctness of this assumption has been supported in several areas. For example, the efficiency of energy use, which was considered pessimistic 50 years ago, has improved substantially today. Therefore, fossil fuel conservation is becoming less of a central issue of intergenerational justice, although it remains in principle. Third, intragenerational justice. Miura is taking issue with the problem of intragenerational justice and the relationship between intergenerational justice. Of course, both are closely related. If the next generation does not reproduce well, the well-being of future generations will be even worse. But I'd like to divide the problem here into smaller pieces. When the demographic balance between generations is distorted, who is being harmed? In many cases, it is the socially disadvantaged. If so, it is not so much a matter of intergenerational justice as it is a matter of justice in the present. Immigration might solve their injustices. Since I am an advocate of libertarianism, I believe that a thorough guarantee of individual liberty would solve the problems of low birth rates. But, of course, there may be other ways to correct the problem. The important thing is to separate justice among those who currently exist from justice for those who do not yet. The area may partially overlap, but philosophically, they constitute very different difficulties. Of course, I am in favor of reducing the difficulties, and limiting the ranges is one of the attempts to do so. All that said, I'm not sure I've answered Miura's question sufficiently, but he has made my thoughts clearer, and for that I thank him from the heart. Thank you.